Somewhere between the late 1970s and the early 1980s, something fundamental broke in the social contract that had sustained American prosperity for over 3 decades. There was no official announcement, no solemn declaration or public ceremony. But in corporate boardrooms, in the halls of Congress, and in the offices of the Federal Reserve, a series of seemingly technical decisions were quietly redesigning the economic future of millions of families. The year 1980 marks the inflection point where the American dream, that tacit promise that hard work would guarantee security and social mobility, began its slow and inexorable transformation into something very different. What happened that year was not a sudden collapse, but the beginning of a systemic reconfiguration that would take decades to be fully understood. And when we finally look back, we realize we were witnessing not just changes in economic policies, but the deliberate betrayal of an entire generation. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, we first need to comprehend the world that was being left behind. For approximately 35 years after the end of World War II, the United States lived through what economists call the golden age of capitalism. It wasn't a perfect system, far from it, but it operated under a relatively simple logic. Profitable companies shared their gains with workers, who in turn consumed more products, fueling a virtuous cycle of growth. Between 1947 and 1973, American productivity grew substantially, and wages tracked that growth almost proportionally. A factory worker with a high school education could buy a house, support a family on a single salary, have paid vacations, and expect a dignified retirement. Strong unions negotiated not just wages, but benefits that included robust health plans and guaranteed pensions. Major corporations accepted this arrangement not out of altruism, but because social stability was good for business. Mass consumption depended on a prosperous middle class. But around 1973, cracks began to appear in this structure. The OPEC oil crisis triggered an inflationary wave that the existing economic system seemed incapable of controlling. For the first time since the Great Depression, Americans experienced simultaneously high inflation and stagnant growth, a phenomenon economists dubbed stagflation. The Keynesian theories that had guided post-war economic policy seemed to have no answers. Confidence in established institutions plummeted. And in this vacuum of certainties, a new economic ideology began to gain traction. It wasn't really new. These were ideas that had been kept on the margins of economic debate for decades, cultivated in conservative think tanks and economics departments that resisted the Keynesian consensus. But now, with the American economy stumbling and public confidence shaken, these ideas found a receptive audience. The year 1980 was transformative, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because it marked the political consolidation of this new economic vision. In November of that year, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States by an overwhelming margin, carrying with him a radically different philosophy about the role of government in the economy. His campaign had promised to cut taxes, reduce regulations, weaken unions, and unleash market forces. But Reagan was not an isolated phenomenon. He represented the culmination of a decade of meticulous political organizing by corporations and economic elites who had concluded that the post-war compact had become an unacceptable obstacle to profits. Corporate lobbyists had flooded Washington since the mid-1970s. Massive public relations campaigns had sown doubts about unions, environmental regulations, and social programs. Strategic political donations had cultivated a new generation of politicians committed to the pro-corporate agenda. And there was another crucial component to this transformation, perhaps the most technical but also the most consequential: the monetary revolution led by Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. Volcker had assumed command of the Fed in 1979 with a singular mandate: destroy inflation at any cost. His weapon of choice was brutally high interest rates. In 1980, the base interest rate in the United States reached stratospheric levels, hitting peaks above 20% in subsequent years. The explicit goal was to cool the economy, reduce demand, and break inflationary expectations. But there was an equally important implicit objective: break the power of workers. High wages had been identified as one of the engines of inflation. Volcker's solution was to create a recession deep enough to generate mass unemployment, thereby weakening the bargaining capacity of unions. It was a deliberate choice: sacrifice jobs and working-class stability on the altar of price stability. The consequences were immediate and devastating for millions of Americans. The recession of the early 1980s was the most severe since the Great Depression. Factories closed en masse, especially in the industrial heartland. Entire cities watched their economic foundations disappear. Unemployment skyrocketed, reaching nearly 11% by the end of 1982. But while workers lost jobs and families lost homes, something deeper was happening. The structures that had protected the middle class for decades were being systematically dismantled. And contrary to what the architects of this new order promised, what would come next would not be shared prosperity, but decades of wage stagnation, growing insecurity, and an unprecedented concentration of wealth at the top of the economic pyramid. The year 1980 was not just a political turning point. It was the moment when the American middle class was deliberately sold out in the name of an economic theory that promised to rich everyone, but would end up enriching mainly those who were already at the top. The transformation that began in 1980 was not accidental, nor was it the inevitable result of impersonal market forces. It was engineered. Behind the rhetoric of freedom, efficiency, and economic growth lay a carefully constructed blueprint designed by a coalition of corporate interests, wealthy donors, and ideological crusaders who had spent years building the intellectual and political infrastructure necessary to fundamentally reshape American capitalism. To understand how the middle class was sold out, we must examine the machinery that made it possible. The networks of influence, the strategic investments in ideas, and the systematic campaign to rewrite the rules of economic engagement in favor of capital over labor. The groundwork had been laid throughout the 1970s, a decade that corporate America perceived as an existential threat. The previous decades had seen an expansion of environmental regulations, consumer protection laws, workplace safety standards, and aggressive antitrust enforcement. From the perspective of business leaders, government had become an adversary rather than an ally. Profit margins were squeezed. Executive autonomy was constrained. The tax burden on corporations and the wealthy remained substantial by later standards. In 1971, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell wrote a confidential memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that would become a founding document of the corporate counter-revolution. Powell's memo argued that American business was under systematic attack and needed to organize politically to defend the free enterprise system. The response was swift and comprehensive. Major corporations dramatically increased their political spending. The number of companies with registered lobbyists in Washington exploded from a few hundred in the early 1970s to thousands by the end of the decade. New business-funded think tanks emerged or expanded dramatically: the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, churning out research, policy proposals, and talking points that provided intellectual ammunition for a pro-business agenda. This organizational effort was matched by a parallel investment in academic economics. The Chicago School of Economics, led by Milton Friedman, had long championed free market fundamentalism, but had remained somewhat marginal to policy discussions dominated by Keynesian thinking. The economic turbulence of the 1970s created an opening. Friedman and his disciples argued that inflation was purely a monetary phenomenon, that government intervention distorted markets and reduced efficiency, and that the solution to economic problems was always less regulation, lower taxes, and unleashed private enterprise. These ideas, once considered extreme, began moving toward the mainstream through a well-funded ecosystem of foundations, academic programs, and media appearances. Friedman himself became a public intellectual, his PBS series Free to Choose bringing free market ideology into millions of American homes. The message was seductive in its simplicity. Government was the problem, markets were the solution, and individual freedom and economic prosperity would flourish once the heavy hand of regulation was lifted. Reagan's election in 1980 brought this entire apparatus to power. His administration was staffed with true believers in the new economic orthodoxy, people who genuinely thought that cutting taxes on the rich, slashing regulations, and breaking union power would unleash prosperity for everyone. The theory was called supply-side economics, though critics derisively labeled it trickle-down. The logic went like this. If you reduce the tax burden on the wealthy and on corporations, they would invest that money in productive enterprises, creating jobs and economic growth that would benefit everyone. It was a fundamental inversion of the post-war logic, which held that prosperity came from ensuring broad-based purchasing power among workers and the middle class. The new theory insisted that prosperity came from the top, from the investment decisions of the wealthy and the profit-seeking of corporations. Give them more resources, remove constraints on their behavior, and everyone would eventually benefit. The policy implementation began almost immediately. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 slashed income tax rates, particularly for the highest earners. The top marginal tax rate, which had been 70%, would eventually be cut to 28% by 1988. Corporate tax rates were similarly reduced. The justification was economic stimulus, but the effect was a massive transfer of resources from the public sector and from ordinary taxpayers to the wealthy. Simultaneously, the Reagan administration launched an assault on regulation across multiple fronts. The Environmental Protection Agency saw its enforcement budget gutted. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration reduced workplace inspections. Financial regulations that had kept the banking sector stable for decades were systematically weakened. The Federal Communications Commission abandoned the fairness doctrine, opening the door to the rise of partisan media. Antitrust enforcement, which had once broken up monopolies and prevented excessive corporate concentration, was effectively abandoned. The new doctrine held that the only legitimate concern was consumer prices, and if mergers and consolidation led to lower prices, even if they destroyed competition and concentrated economic power, they should be allowed. But perhaps the most consequential move was the administration's approach to organized labor. Unions had been the primary mechanism through which ordinary workers claimed their share of economic growth. In August 1981, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization went on strike, seeking better working conditions and higher pay. Reagan's response was unprecedented. He fired all 11,345 striking air traffic controllers and banned them from federal service for life. It was a signal heard throughout corporate America. Strikes, once a legitimate tool of labor negotiation, would now be met with termination. Companies that had previously negotiated with unions now felt emboldened to take a harder line. Union-busting consultants became a booming industry. Corporations began systematically closing unionized plants and reopening non-union facilities elsewhere. The percentage of American workers in unions, which had peaked at around 35% in the 1950s, began a steady decline that continues to this day. By destroying union power, corporations eliminated the primary countervailing force that had ensured workers shared in productivity gains. The architects of these changes promised that short-term pain would lead to long-term prosperity. The recession of 1981-1982 was framed as necessary medicine. Once inflation was conquered and the economy restructured, they insisted growth would return and lift all boats. And there was indeed growth, but it was growth of a fundamentally different character than what had come before. For the first time in American history, productivity and wages began to diverge dramatically. Companies became more profitable, but those profits increasingly went to shareholders and executives rather than workers. The middle class did not disappear overnight. But the mechanisms that had created and sustained it, strong unions, progressive taxation, corporate norms that valued stakeholders beyond just shareholders, robust public investment, were being systematically dismantled. The betrayal of 1980 was not a single dramatic moment, but an architecture of policy choices, each defended with technical economic arguments that collectively redirected the fruits of economic growth away from the many and toward the few. By the mid-1980s, the immediate crisis had passed. Inflation had been tamed, broken on the wheel of high interest rates and mass unemployment. The economy began growing again, and for those watching aggregate statistics, things looked promising. GDP expanded, stock markets climbed, and a new wave of technological innovation suggested that American capitalism had successfully reinvented itself. But beneath these optimistic headlines, something profound and disturbing was taking shape. A great divergence between the fortunes of different classes of Americans that would define the next 4 decades. The covenant that had linked productivity to broadly shared prosperity was irretrievably broken, and in its place emerged an economic system that efficiently funneled wealth upward while leaving the middle class treading water. The data tells a stark story. From 1948 to 1973, productivity in the American economy grew by roughly 97%, and median family income grew by 95%, nearly perfect synchronization. Workers were getting their fair share of the wealth they helped create. But after 1980, this relationship shattered. Between 1979 and 2019, productivity grew by more than 70%, while typical worker compensation increased by only 17% when adjusted for inflation. The wealth that workers created through their labor was still being generated, but it was now being captured almost entirely by corporate shareholders and executives. This was not a natural phenomenon or an unfortunate accident. It was the direct and predictable result of the policy choices made in and after 1980. The weakening of unions, the reduction of progressive taxation, the deregulation of industries, and the elevation of shareholder value above all other considerations. The transformation of corporate behavior itself represented one of the most significant shifts. During the post-war era, major corporations had operated under what management theorists called stakeholder capitalism. Companies understood themselves as having obligations not just to shareholders, but to employees, communities, and the broader public interest. It was not pure altruism. Corporate leaders recognized that stable, well-compensated workforces and healthy communities were good for long-term business success. But beginning in the 1970s and accelerating after 1980, a new doctrine took hold: shareholder primacy. The only legitimate purpose of a corporation, according to this philosophy, was to maximize returns to shareholders. Everything else was secondary at best, wasteful sentimentality at worst. This shift had enormous practical consequences. Companies that had traditionally provided secure employment, good benefits, and funded pensions began viewing these commitments as inefficient costs to be minimized. Mass layoffs, once considered a sign of corporate failure, became a routine management tool to boost quarterly earnings. Pensions were frozen or eliminated, replaced by 401(k) plans that shifted all investment risk onto workers. Health insurance benefits were cut or made more expensive. The implicit bargain, loyalty and hard work in exchange for security, was unilaterally abandoned. Globalization and technological change were frequently cited as inevitable forces driving these transformations, factors beyond anyone's control. And certainly, these forces were real and consequential. Manufacturing jobs did face competition from lower-wage countries. Automation did reduce the need for certain types of labor. But the way America responded to these challenges was not predetermined. Other developed nations facing the same global pressures maintained stronger social safety nets, preserved union power, and implemented policies that ensured technological gains were broadly shared. The distinctive feature of the American experience was not the challenges themselves, but the policy choices that left workers and the middle class to bear the full brunt of disruption, while protecting and enriching those at the top. When factories closed and moved overseas, displaced workers received minimal support for retraining or transition. When automation eliminated jobs, there was no serious discussion of sharing productivity gains through shorter work weeks or stronger unemployment insurance. The new economic philosophy held that market adjustments, however painful for individuals and communities, should not be cushioned by government intervention. The financial sector's transformation exemplified these broader dynamics. Banking deregulation, which began in earnest in the 1980s and culminated with the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, unleashed a wave of speculation and risk-taking that would ultimately lead to the 2008 financial crisis. But long before that crisis, the financialization of the economy was already redistributing wealth upward. Wall Street compensation soared while manufacturing wages stagnated. Private equity firms pioneered techniques of buying companies, loading them with debt, extracting maximum short-term value, and discarding the wreckage. Jobs destroyed, pensions looted, communities devastated. The growth of the financial sector relative to the productive economy meant that an increasing share of national income was going to those who shuffled money rather than those who made things or provided services. And when the inevitable crisis arrived in 2008, the response revealed whose interests truly mattered. Banks deemed too big to fail received trillions in bailouts and support. Homeowners who lost their houses to predatory lending and fraudulent practices received token assistance at best. The lesson was unmistakable. In the new economic order, capital would always be protected while labor would always be expendable. The social and political consequences of this great divergence extended far beyond economics. Communities that had been built around stable manufacturing employment collapsed when those jobs disappeared. Opioid addiction and deaths of despair soared in regions most affected by deindustrialization. Marriage rates declined as economic instability made family formation more precarious. Educational attainment increasingly determined life outcomes, but the cost of higher education skyrocketed, trapping millions in crushing student debt. Meanwhile, the wealthy increasingly self-segregated into exclusive enclaves, their children attending elite private schools and inheriting positions of power and privilege. Social mobility, the idea that anyone could climb the economic ladder through hard work, declined. America began to resemble an hereditary aristocracy more than the land of opportunity it claimed to be. The middle class that had been the foundation of American democracy and social stability found itself squeezed from every direction. Stagnant wages, rising costs for housing, healthcare, and education, disappearing pensions, and mounting debt. The promise of 1980 that unleashing market forces would create broadly shared prosperity had proven to be a lie. The middle class had been sold out, and the bill was coming due not just in economic terms, but in fraying social cohesion and declining faith in institutions. 4 decades after 1980, the full dimensions of the betrayal have become impossible to ignore. The promises made by the architects of the new economic order, that cutting taxes on the wealthy would stimulate investment and job creation, that weakening unions would make the economy more efficient and competitive, that deregulation would unleash innovation and prosperity for all, have been tested by time and found catastrophically wanting. What we have instead is an economy that generates enormous wealth while leaving the majority of Americans economically insecure, politically disillusioned, and increasingly convinced that the system is rigged against them. Because it is. The social contract was not accidentally broken. It was deliberately dismantled by those who stood to profit from its destruction. And the consequences of that choice now threaten the stability of American democracy itself. The statistical evidence of failure is overwhelming and undeniable. The wealth gap between the richest Americans and everyone else has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The top 1% of households now control more wealth than the entire middle class combined. CEO compensation has exploded to ratios of 300 to 1 or higher compared to median worker pay, whereas in 1980 that ratio was closer to 30 to 1. Meanwhile, real wages for the median worker have barely budged in 40 years. The cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, childcare, education has vastly outpaced income growth, meaning that even families with 2 working parents often struggle to achieve the standard of living that a single breadwinner could provide in the 1970s. The retirement security that defined middle-class life has evaporated for millions, as traditional pensions disappeared and 401k accounts proved woefully inadequate. Medical bankruptcy, virtually unknown in peer-developed nations with universal healthcare systems, has become a leading cause of personal financial catastrophe in America. Student loan debt has reached nearly $2 trillion, crippling the economic prospects of an entire generation. These are not the outcomes of a system that is working for ordinary people. The political ramifications of economic betrayal have proven equally toxic. When people feel that the system no longer works for them, when they watch their living standards stagnate or decline while the wealthy grow ever richer, when they see corporations pay minimal taxes while their own tax burden feels crushing, when they lose jobs to outsourcing or automation while executives receive massive bonuses, they lose faith in democratic institutions and become susceptible to authoritarian demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems. The rise of right-wing populism, the appeal of conspiracy theories, the erosion of trust and expertise in institutions, these are not separate phenomena from the economic transformations that began in 1980. They are direct consequences. A middle class that feels secure and sees opportunity for their children supports democratic stability. A middle class that feels betrayed and sees no path forward becomes dangerously volatile. The political chaos and polarization that now characterize American public life can be traced directly to the economic choices made 4 decades ago. Yet, despite this mountain of evidence, the basic architecture of the post-1980 economic order remains largely intact. Tax rates on the wealthy, while fluctuating, remain far below post-war levels. Union membership continues its decline, now representing barely 10% of the workforce and only 6% in the private sector. Financial regulation, despite the lessons of 2008, remains inadequate to prevent the next crisis. Healthcare remains tied to employment and ruinously expensive. Higher education costs continue to spiral upward. The minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is lower than it was in 1968. Corporate consolidation has created monopolistic or oligopolistic conditions in industry after industry, from airlines to pharmaceuticals to technology platforms, concentrating economic power and reducing competition. The fundamental premise that markets, left largely to their own devices, will produce optimal outcomes for society remains the default assumption of policymakers in both major political parties, despite decades of evidence to the contrary. Breaking this deadlock will require more than minor adjustments at the margins. It demands a recognition that the economic model imposed after 1980 has failed the vast majority of Americans and must be fundamentally restructured. This means rebuilding worker power through strengthened unions and labor protections. It means progressive taxation that ensures the wealthy pay their fair share and that public investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and research can be adequately funded. It means antitrust enforcement that breaks up concentrated corporate power and restores genuine competition. It means financial regulation that prevents speculation and protects ordinary people from predatory practices. It means universal health care that severs the link between employment and medical coverage. It means affordable higher education and robust social insurance programs that protect security against the inevitable disruptions of technological change and global economic forces. None of these ideas are radical or untested. They are, in fact, the basic features of successful mixed economies throughout the developed world, and they were largely the features of American capitalism during its most successful and equitable period. The story of how the middle class was sold out in 1980 is not just historical curiosity. It is the essential context for understanding our present crisis and imagining a different future. For 4 decades, we have lived with the consequences of an economic experiment that enriched a small minority while leaving the majority behind. The experiment has failed. The question now is whether we have the political will to acknowledge that failure honestly and to build something better, or whether we will continue down a path that leads inexorably toward greater inequality, social disintegration, and democratic collapse. The year 1980 represented a choice, deliberate and consequential, to prioritize capital over labor, wealth over work, and private gain over public good. We can make a different choice, but only if we first understand what was done to us, who did it, and why, and only if we decide that the promise of shared prosperity and genuine opportunity is worth fighting to reclaim. The middle class was sold out. The bill has come due, and the reckoning can no longer be postponed.